Tila po ba naka-hyperdrive na ang naging pag-disburse ni SDO Acosta para siguruhing ma-expend ang allocated confidential funds sa OVP sa mga nalalabing araw ng 2022. Notably, the following day or Christmas Eve of 2022, these disbursements continued based on the 40 acknowledgement receipts from the OVP on this date. It spent a total of 5,429,000 pesos on supposed confidential activities. Grabe talaga itong OVP non-stop kahit magpapasko na.
The Chair would like to recognize the Honorable Rog Gutierrez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Just taking off from where Congressman Akop started. But before that, I would like to start by saying that this has been one of the most fruitful committee hearings that I've had the pleasure in joining. Throughout the course of 7 hearings, we have brought detail to some long-held suspicions, the confidential funds of the OVP and DepEd that had been abused, or malversed, or maybe even taken. By abused, I mean that the relevant officers of the OVP and the DepEd took advantage of gaps in and in fact violated Joint Circular 2015-001. Mahirap po na problema ito. Pera po ng taong bayan ang pinag-uusapan dito, and unless we are aware of these gaps and violations, the legal regime cannot and will not change for the better. Today, I'd like to go through some of these violations as mentioned by Congressman Akop. The SDO has the sole mandate to disburse the CF, the confidential funds, and to prepare and submit the liquidation reports of cash advances with the relevant supporting documentation as prescribed under the Joint Circular. Siya lamang. On the other hand, a security officer is a personnel who has been officially designated as such to have access to security information. Klaro po ang kani-kanilang mga responsibilidad. Ang SDO po ang sa disbursement o ang sa pagbibigay ng pera. Ang SO naman, yung security officer naman, ay binibigyan lamang ng access sa impormasyon. To elaborate and para po sa kaalaman ng lahat, under the Joint Circular, the SDO is personally tasked with the disbursement and liquidation of confidential funds. Ang SDO ang tagabigay ng pera, siya lang under the Joint Circular. Natural lang po ito dahil ang SDO ang isa sa mga accountable officers or those public officers personally accountable when something goes wrong with respect to the utilization or disbursement of these confidential funds. And this is precisely the reason why kinakailangan may fidelity bond ang SDO. The fidelity bond is there so that if anything happens to the funds while it is in the custody of the SDO, sigurado na may maibabalik pa rin na pondo to the government through the bond and for the security of the taxpayers. Yung head of agency is also personally tasked to oversee the agency-wide use and disposition of confidential funds. Siya rin ang nag-a-appoint ng SDO. Because of the functions that burden the head of agency is also an accountable officer. Sa makatuwid, yung SDO po yung inaatasan ng batas natin na humawak at siguraduhin mapunta ang confidential funds sa naaayon na confidential expenses allowed under the Joint Circular. Hindi niya pwedeng i-delegate ang custody ng confidential funds dahil siya ang mananagot rito. Hindi niya pwedeng iutos sa iba. Hindi pwedeng ibigay sa security officer. In the case of SDO Edward Fajarda of the DepEd, while he has admitted to having encashed the 3 checks amounting to 37.5 million pesos each, he has also claimed that he did not know or had no way of knowing how the funds were to be utilized after handing them over to the designated security officer. Mr. Fajarda stated that since it was Colonel Nolasco who is the expert in confidential operations, it was Colonel Nolasco who supposedly made the disbursements of the confidential funds in different localities. It begs the question, sino po ba ang totoong special disbursing officer? Kung ang nag-iisang taong pinagdi-disperse ng SDO ay si Colonel Nolasco, kung pagka-encash ng cheque ay agaran naman itong inaabot sa security officer. Whatever happened to Mr. Fajardo being an accountable officer under the Joint Circular? Kung wala siyang slightest idea kung saan napupunta o kanino ibinibigay ang confidential funds? Is his role in this entire process simply ministerial? We beg to disagree. Mr. Fajardo is not just a simple bagman that would withdraw the funds and turn over to the security officer. His role, as material as it is, carries with it discretion. Discretion to ensure the accuracy of the data in the liquidation reports and to be accountable for the disbursements from the cash advances of confidential funds. But Mr. Fajardo admitted that he merely relied on the documents evidencing payments submitted by the security officer. His failure to exercise the standard care and diligence required of and inherent in his function is the height of irresponsibility and is in clear violation of his mandate under the Joint Circular. At bakit po nangyari ito? Dahil ito raw ang sabi ng head of agency ng DepEd doon na si VP Sara na ibigay ang pera sa security officer. Same case po tayo with SDO Gina Acosta of the OVP. Ms. Acosta also admitted that the utilization and payment of the confidential funds involves her handing over the money to a security officer per the instruction of no less than head of the agency, Vice President Duterte. SDO Acosta also supposedly never knew where the security officer took or expended the confidential funds. She has only testified on the basis of the information supposedly fed to her, without certainty as to who are the actual recipients or payees of the confidential funds, whether they are even actual persons. In the past hearings, it has always been made to appear that Ms. Acosta for OVP and Mr. Fajarda for DepEd would have the most knowledge as the SDOs of the confidential funds. And we have always been made to believe that it would be the two of them who would be able to shed light on the discrepancies flagged by the COA and the other erroneous and false matters po na didiscover po namin through these hearings. Unfortunately, the SDOs themselves violated their own accountability, their own certifications in the liquidation report, with them disclaiming knowledge kung saan or kanino ba talaga pumunta ang bawat sentimo ng confidential funds. They violated a particular responsibility under item 4.15.1 of the joint circular, where they are supposed to certify at least two things: na sila ang accountable for the disbursements of confidential funds and that the expenses were incurred in connection with the agency's confidential activities. How can they faithfully attest to these kung binibigay lang din naman nila yung confidential funds sa ibang tao or empleyado? Basta mangako din sa kanya yung empleyado, halimbawa, nagagamitin yung pera pambayad sa informer or pang-conduct ng surveillance activities. Now let's move on to another reeling discovery na atin din pong na-uncover throughout the hearings. And this is with respect to the certifications issued by officers of the AFP, submitted by the DepEd to the COA in support of the DepEd's utilization of confidential funds for payment of rewards to informers. Matatandaang mahigit 15 million pesos of the confidential funds spending of the DepEd went to payment of reward to informers. This expense item has been flagged by the COA in view of the DepEd's failure to provide sufficient supporting documentation on the success of the agency's own information gathering and surveillance activities. Para po ipaalala sa nakakarami, under the joint circular, one of the conditions that must be met in order for an agency or office to use confidential funds to pay rewards to informers is supporting documentation evidencing the success of the information gathering and or surveillance activities on account of the information provided by the informer. Based on the respective accomplishment reports and the acknowledgement receipts submitted by the OVP and the DepEd, the total amounts utilized for the payment of reward to informers is 96,980,000 pesos for the OVP, covering the period from the fourth quarter of 2022 until the third quarter of 2023, and 21,921,000 pesos for DepEd from the first to third quarters of 2023. This is a total of 118,901,000 pesos. Napakarami po sanang classroom, tuition, sweldo ng guro, at iba pa ang pwedeng paggamitan nito. I stress also that this amount of money is just for supposed payment of rewards. It does not include all other things for which confidential funds were spent for. When inquired about the certifications which the DepEd submitted to the COA, former Undersecretary and Chief of Staff of the Office of the Secretary of DepEd, Mr. Michael Poa, admitted to having asked retired Major General Nolasco Mempin to secure said certifications from the AFP as a means to justify the use of confidential funds, despite DepEd not being directly involved in AFP-led activities. This was confirmed by former Education Undersecretary Major General Mempin, who stated on record that the DepEd has not released any single centavo to the conduct of youth leadership summits. The AFP officers themselves admitted that they did not receive any funding from the DepEd. The summits were actually funded by the budget of the Philippine Army and from funds of participating local government units, as confirmed by Colonel Boransing. Lieutenant Colonel Panopio also supported Colonel Boransing's statements that they were not aware that certifications issued by them would be used to justify the DepEd's confidential fund spending for informants. We eventually came to know that these certifications issued by Army Civil Military Operations Staff Officers Colonel Boransing, Lieutenant Colonel Sangdaan Jr., and Colonel Magtanggol Panopio for the youth leadership summits and information education campaigns in 2023 only showed that the fact that these events were successfully conducted at the different barangays in their areas of responsibility. This is yet another clear derogation of the joint circular. DepEd misleadingly made it appear that the agency used confidential funds for payment of rewards to informers, despite the DepEd for youth training programs, when in truth, it was the AFP and the LGUs which actually shouldered the expenses from their respective confidential fund allocations. There was never any correlation between DepEd's supposed surveillance or information gathering activities with the AFP's successful conduct of its summits and campaigns in partnership with the LGUs. The DepEd took advantage of the AFP, rode in the coattails of the AFP, and misled the AFP into issuing certifications for a project that is not the DepEd's to begin with. And who could forget the many anomalies we were able to uncover with respect to the acknowledgement receipts or documents evidencing payment submitted by the DepEd and the OVP to the COA. With the select few that we were able to highlight throughout the hearings, ay marami po talagang lumutang na discrepancies na ni dapat ipasawalang bahala. We were able to trace the disbursements by counter-checking the dates indicated in the ARs, and we came to know through this hearing that DepEd SDO was able to complete a job that we believe is humanly impossible. An examination of the acknowledgement receipts submitted by the DepEd for the first quarter of 2023 revealed that Mr. Fajardo made disbursements for 38 consecutive days, and for 35 out of those 38 days, payouts were made to at least 10 to 26 people per day and for various purposes. For example, reward payment, incentives, supplies, rentals, traveling expenses, etc. This is something that could not be easily missed because the acknowledgement receipts, at least for the DepEd, have fields where the payees indicate the date they received the payment and their own addresses or location. We will recall that on February 21, 2023, or the very next day after SDO Fajardo encashed a 37.5 million peso check with the Land Bank, the SDO made 7 disbursements already in 7 different locations, as evidenced by the acknowledgement receipts recorded for that date. Hindi kapani-paniwala for one person designated as the SDO to have made disbursements in Malolos, Bulacan, Danao, Cebu, San Francisco, Agusan del Sur, Makati City, Negros Occidental, Negros Oriental, and Davao City all in one day. Worse, we found other examples of DepEd acknowledgement receipts of the same date but varied widely in terms of the localities where the payments were made. Plotting these on the Philippine map, within a single day on March 15, 2023, there were 26 disbursements which were made across 24 localities from Batanes to Davao del Sur, with total confidential expenses amounting to 1,870,000 pesos. On the 9th of March 2023, the DepEd, supposedly through its SDO, was able to make 20 disbursements over 18 localities all over the Philippines, with disbursements of confidential funds amounting to more than 1,400,000 pesos. And lastly, on February 25, 2023, there were 21 disbursements across 18 localities all over the country amounting to almost 1,400,000 pesos. All 3 examples reinforce our point that no amount of imagination can make us believe that these disbursements were made to these people at these locations and at these dates. It is physically impossible. Even assuming that the DepEd has its satellite offices and field personnel all over the country, we should always go back to the joint circular as our Bible. The function of disbursing and of being accountable for the cash advances of the confidential funds is lodged with the SDO and the SDO alone. Delegating this function to any other officer or employee would run counter to the express guidelines of the joint circular and the safeguards that it entails. Unsurprisingly, the same discrepancies have been observed in the OVP acknowledgement receipts, particularly for the payouts and disbursements for the fourth quarter of 2022. For everyone's recollection, this period refers to the 11 days when the OVP was able to use up 125 million pesos worth of confidential funds, and markedly, there were at least 3 days out of those 11 days that the payouts reached 100 recipients. For instance, noon pong December 23, 2022, based on the records and the AR submitted by the OVP to the COA, SDO Gina Acosta was able to disburse more than 15 million pesos to 103 distinct individuals for various purposes. Tila po ba naka-hyperdrive na ang naging pag-disburse ni SDO Acosta para siguruhing ma-expend ang allocated confidential funds sa OVP sa mga nalalabing araw ng 2022. Notably, the following day or Christmas Eve of 2022, these disbursements continued. Based on the 40 acknowledgement receipts from the OVP on this date, it spent a total of 5,429,000 pesos on supposed confidential activities. Grabe talaga itong OVP non-stop kahit magpapasko na. Whoever disbursed more than 5 billion pesos truly embodied the spirit of generosity during the holidays. If it was actually true this amount was disbursed for confidential expenses. Lastly, we found acknowledgement receipts that the OVP reported and submitted for the fourth quarter of 2022, but bear dates outside the period for which they are intended to be used as proof. Na-observe po namin how the OVP fourth quarter acknowledgement receipts were dated December 2023, when they have been supposedly paid out to and received by the recipients in 2022. Understandably, a person can instinctively write the past year in documents when welcoming a new year. But we find it very eccentric po, kasi for a person writing a date in 2022 and mistakenly indicating the immediately succeeding year, 2023, wala po yata ibang reason dito except that the acknowledgement receipts were indeed executed in 2023 and not in 2022, contrary to what the OVP is trying to establish. Sa dami po nang na-discover natin in the past hearings na sinubaybayan po ng publiko, we uncovered irregularities and deficiencies in the disbursements and reporting of the confidential funds allocated to the OVP and to the DepEd. This has been an extremely insightful exercise of our mandate as we were able to examine the sufficiency of our current legislation and how this current legislation safeguards us from potential misuse and abuse of public funds, as well as the potential malfeasance, misfeasance, and nonfeasance in the office by officers and employees of the government. Our task does not end here. It is now our duty to craft legislation that will protect the public coffers and ensure that they are not used and abused by public servants for their personal agenda. With that, Mr. Chair, I conclude my part of the hearing. Thank you po.
Umani naman ito ng iba't ibang reaksyon mula sa ating mga netizens. Ayon kay Jerry Daunos, tinik sa pangungurakot nyo si VP Sara. Gawin nyo kung saan kayo masaya, but VP is our future president. Pahayag naman ni Albert Salang, pabida-bida ang mga aso ni Tamba ngayon. These politicians are the one pulling down the country, kawawa mga ordinaryong Pinoy sa inyo. At ito naman ang saloobin mula sa ating kababayan na si Lloyd Gutierrez, bata pa itong mga congressman nato pero hirap nang makakita sa katotohanan. Mga kababayan, feel free to comment below para maglabas ng saloobin sa balitang ito.